Welcome back, Trawler fans and owners. Today's video is all about varnishing. So in this video, I'm going to go through the process for preparation and execution of varnishing a teak sole. I would not recommend rushing through a project. Varnishing is absolutely an art form. You've got to get in tune with the materials that you're using. You've got to keep that wet edge. You can tape this if you want. What kind of artist are you? Michelangelo wasn't using tape. Get sushi the night before so that you have some chopsticks. Execute well the first time.
I'm Joe, and this is Johnny.
In the past year, we bought old trawlers to live aboard. We've been learning, upgrading, and adventuring on our yachts Toko and Estrellas ever since.
Subscribe to our channel to see how far we've come and just how far we'll go. Welcome aboard.
Big thanks to Sea Y'all Life, who I've got linked here. They are living aboard a 44-foot DeFever here in San Diego, and reached out to me about having their floors done after they saw what I did on mine. So love to keep work inside the Trawler family like that, and very happy to work on boats, especially boats like this that are, you know, a step above where I am, and you know, that are boats that I hope to one day own. Let's begin with the prep work. The first thing that you need to do is clean the floor as best you can. And so in this case, I vacuumed, I used denatured alcohol and rags, I vacuumed some more, and we got, well, before all that, we got everything off the floor, all the furniture, rugs and things like that. Because you're gonna, when it comes time to varnish, you're gonna wanna start at one end and go all the way to the other side without stopping. So once you've got the floor clean, then you can go ahead and sand. Depending on how old the floor is or when the last time the teak decks were done, you might need to use a heavier grit sandpaper. In this case, I was able to start with 220 because the previous owners of this boat had carpet on the floors. And so that made it a lot easier. I didn't have to use a heavy grit. I didn't get everything all dusty inside. Really drastically reduced cleanup time as well. A couple tips for your sanding phase. Make sure you get the corners really well. So I like to use a sanding block for the corners. So I'll usually start and do the whole perimeter with the sanding block, just to get it an even starting place all the way around, so that then once I come back with the power sander and I'm, you know, cruising on the rest of the floors, I don't have to worry about getting up into the corners at that point. While you're doing the edges too, if you're using a sanding block, be careful which way your sanding block is facing, because if you've got it wrapped around the block so that the sandpaper will rub on the wall, you're going to take off some, whether it's a veneer or paint or anything like that. You do not want to be scraping sandpaper all along the walls. You can tape if you want. I choose not to tape when I varnish because for two reasons. One, I think that varnishing is absolutely an art form. So I think, you know, you look at the Sistine Chapel and Michelangelo wasn't using tape. And kind of a compliment to that statement is that if you're not taping, you have to really pay attention and go very slowly so that you're not making mistakes. Now, what if you make a mistake, Joe? Come on, it's gonna happen. It does. So what you do though is, usually I'll have my varnish cup in one hand, and in that same hand I'll have an old rag with some denatured alcohol on it, so that if I do nick the wall or have a drip or something like that, particularly exterior work, if you have a drip that goes on the fiberglass, that'll be really obvious. So you just keep that denatured alcohol rag handy so that you can wipe it off and have no problems. So once you've got all the edges sanded to your satisfaction, then it's time to come back, and I choose to use a power sander. A lot of different ideas there. I think that a power sander gets you a little bit more even and flat distribution of sandpaper. Sanding by hand, you're gonna end up with grooves for sure. If you're really old school, you can just use a sanding block and just go away at it. But again, I don't think that the value added by doing that is worth the time and effort, particularly with older boats where the floors, you know, are decades old. and they've got some natural lean and tilt to them, or maybe especially on like a parquet floor like this one. It's really just not a flat, even surface to begin with. So I've found that just sanding with an orbital sander really does a great job. And I use a 5-inch sanding head, so that still gives me pretty good even coverage. Again, for a project like this, on a boat like this, I think it actually looks a lot better to leave some of the impurities, leave some of the, you know, natural changes that have come with time on a project like this. I like to use 220 because it'll provide a nice grippy surface for your varnish to adhere to. But before you varnish, it is probably more important to get a good clean again at this point than it was in the beginning. At this point, you've kicked up a lot of sawdust, a lot of wood, dust, dirt, hair, you name it. If it was in the top layer of that floor, you've kicked it up. And so before you can put varnish down, you've got to clean that, so it just won't stick. If there's dust in between your floor and your varnish, it'll start to peel and crack and bubble, and everything you've done basically you'll have to redo. So what I did here, and I recommend for any sort of project like this, is begin by just using a vacuum and suck up as much as you can, and then go back with, I'll just use a wet rag, and you know, the whole floor by hand with the wet rag. Sometimes if it's a big space, you'll need a couple. And then after getting like the majority of the stuff up, I'll go back with that wet rag and either like a chopstick or a pencil or something that I can get into the corners really well with. So I use that wet rag, get into the corners. The dust really likes to collect in there, and sometimes the vacuum nozzle even is just not enough to get into those cracks. Then once you're satisfied that you've got most of the major dust particles up, then it's time to get the denatured alcohol again. And so at this point, I recommend using a low lint or lint-free rag. They're worth the money because you won't have any fuzz after this point. So you'll just soak that in denatured alcohol. Again, go around the whole thing. Again, I would do the corners first to really get any gunk out of there with the chopstick again. And then the whole floor, boom, 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 long, even strokes. And your denatured alcohol should evaporate within about 30 seconds of applying it. That's kind of an easy way to make sure you're using enough, but you're not using too much. And so wipe the whole floor down and let it sit for a few minutes until it's all the way dry, at which point you are ready to varnish. First, you've got to mix your varnish. Refer to the instructions on each individual manufacturer's label, because some varnishes will say you don't need to cut with thinner, some will require a 50-50 for the first coat, and then you can reduce it. Really depends on the manufacturer's recommendations and then the environment in which you're putting your varnish down. So in this case, I was inside doing the floor, so there was not a lot of wind. The temperature was going to stay the same, about 60 degrees, and I knew that I would be able to evenly spread the varnish pretty close to its most concentrated form. It's because I knew I would be able to get a pretty even spread with the varnish straight out of the can. I still cut it. I did an 8-to-1 mix with 216 thinner, and I've always been very happy with that combination. That's typically what I'll do for all my exterior teak on my own boat. Once you've poured your correct proportions into your varnish cup, I use a chopstick again and just mix that up really well. You don't want to shake your varnish before you mix it. That'll get you bubbles, and it's just not recommended. That the back of the can actually says not to do it. And then, so yeah, mix it up really well, and then you're ready to start putting varnish on the floor. Big reminder here, start on one end of the boat so that you can end on the others without having to go back and try and hit some holidays or redo areas that you might have missed. And also, definitely, you don't want to paint yourself into a corner, literally, because you'll end up trying to climb across furniture and stuff like that, or make sure both doors are unlocked and open before you get started. So if you you walked in on this side of the boat and then you varnish over to this end of the boat, you've got a way to get out without having to get back to this door. So in this case, it's pretty easy, nice, wide, even floor, and I was able to do that pretty much no problem. There's a very specific technique for varnishing that I really love to follow. I find it very therapeutic, very repetitive, and a great way to get an even coat everywhere you go on the boat. It's called keeping a wet edge. As you can see in this clip, what I'll do is I'll wet my brush and then dab it across the area that I'm gonna go, and then I'll pull the brush through so that it is pulling varnish the whole way across. Rather than if you just keep it on the brush and pull, you'll have a little bit heavier where the brush first hits, and then as it pulls, it'll get thinner and thinner. And then, you know, you'll just end up with uneven areas of varnish on the floor. A good way to know if you're using the right amount of varnish is by listening to the brush. And so whatever kind of boat job you're doing, or anything with your hands, whether it's carpentry, mechanical work, in this case, varnishing, painting, everything like that, you've got to get in tune with the materials that you're using. So when you're varnishing, whether it's with a foam brush like I use, or with a natural fiber hairbrush, if you hear the brush starting to shh, 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 that means you don't have enough on your brush. So that's why you'll see in my video, I'm dabbing little bits at a time and pulling and dabbing, and it's very repetitive, but it keeps a very even amount of varnish across the whole project. Again, when you hear that pulling and that shh a little bit, that means that you're getting to a lot of friction, and basically you're having your foam or your horsehair brush right onto the wood without enough varnish. So I think of it kind of as like a lubrication. The varnish is lubricating the space between the brush and whatever surface you're varnishing. There are a couple areas you really want to be careful with as you're varnishing. One we kind of talked about is just keeping the wet edge. That's imperative. No matter what part of the boat or what part of the floor project you're working on, you've got to keep that wet edge. That's another point for just consistency, is that the reason you keep that wet edge is so that as you pull the brush through, you never get to that point where you're hearing that sound and you're running out of varnish, because you're going from dabs of varnish into a wet area already. So that's the way to keep it really nice and smooth, so that when it all dries, you're not going to see individual brush strokes on the deck. The other areas to worry about, all the edges. I mentioned before how I cleaned that up, but you can see here I'm going really slowly around the edges, and then any sort of fittings that are on the floor as well. Typically that'll be hatches that access the engine room. So any stainless steel stuff you want to stay away from as best you can. Again, you can tape this if you want, but what kind of artist are you if you do? Also, if you do, you know, kind of get a little spillage on stainless steel, that's pretty easy to scrape off at the end, but best to just execute well the first time so you don't have to do that. The other area to be very careful with is where those hatches meet the permanent floor. So the threat here is that you could end up varnishing shut those hatches, and then when it all dries and you go to pull up the engine room cover, you're gonna crack all that varnish because it's all attached in one sheet. So you need to make sure that there's space between the cracks of the permanent floor and the hatch that pulls up. Just like, you know, you wouldn't paint over a light socket because then you can't plug something in. In this case, you're not gonna paint over that edge because it won't hinge. Once you've worked your way across the whole floor and you're happy with your job, then let it sit at least 2 hours for most varnishes. Again, refer to the back of the can to see what they recommend. But usually varnish will be dry to the touch in 2 to 3 hours and dry for recoating in 6 to 12 to 24. I like to give at least overnight before I do a new coat, just to make sure that everything is really all the way settled. On this particular project, and for most teak soles that are in pretty good condition, I'd recommend 2 or 3 coats. For this one I did 2 coats because it was looking good, and like I said, the previous owners had wall-to-wall carpet, and the current owners have a lot of throw rugs and things like that that cover a lot of the floor. So there's not actually going to be that much foot traffic across these floors once I'm done. Either way though, you want to have at least 2 to get some more durability and hardness back and really get that awesome shine. As far as cost goes on a project like this, the biggest spending item is going to be the varnish itself. For a gallon of Captain's 1015 varnish, which I used on this project, which is a little more than I needed, it costs $125 at the local West Marine. You can get smaller cans, which are cheaper, but in this case, I needed more than a couple of the small ones, so I got the big one, which ultimately is the most cost-effective way to do it. The other big spending item is time. This takes a long time and a lot of patience and a lot of attention to detail to do a good job on a project like this. Again, I would not recommend rushing through a project like this, but if time is of the essence and beauty is less of the essence to you, then you can tape all around everything, the walls and the fittings and things like that. You can tape around it, and then you can go and varnish a little bit faster. But again, if you're going faster, you can't hear as much of what's going on with the brush and the wood, and you're probably just not going to end up with as good of a final product as if you go really nice and slow. Aside from that, foam brushes are, I think the big ones which I use in this video are like $2, $3 a piece, and you can use 1 per coat pretty much. Miscellaneous items to include thinner is a couple bucks for a quart. You don't need a lot of that because it's only a 10-to-1, 8-to-1 mixture. Chopsticks, get sushi the night before, so that you have some chopsticks left over. And denatured alcohol. This one is a little bit tricky here in California. There are a lot of rules about chemical production and sales and things like that. So denatured alcohol is no longer sold at our local chandlery, but the chemical formula compound of denatured alcohol is actually the same as white camping stove fuel. So if you can get your hands on that, it's actually, I think, cheaper than denatured alcohol was in the first place. You can use that. Acetone works as well, but it's a pretty harsh chemical, so I really try to use denatured alcohol or camping fuel if it's available. That's pretty much what it takes. So if you have any questions, please drop a comment below. I love answering them, and would love to hear some discussion about your favorite type of varnish, different techniques you do. If you saw me do something you disagree with, just lay on it. Please just be respectful. The idea of this page is to be helpful and for all of us to be able to learn something from it. So continue with your boats, enjoy them. Let me know if you have questions about any other projects you've seen me do, and I would love to help you learn some more.